Hey, it's Brett, and today is my first day reading any Kropotkin. This is The Wage System, published in 1920, and this is Section 1, Representative Government and Wages. In their plan for the reconstruction of society, the collectivists commit, in our opinion, a double error. Whilst speaking of the abolition of the rule of capital, they wish nevertheless to maintain two institutions which form the very basis of that rule, namely representative government and the wage system. As for representative government, it remains absolutely incomprehensible to us how intelligent men, and they are not wanting amongst the collectivists, can continue to be the partisans of national and municipal parliaments. After all the lessons we've learned on this subject uh, in history, whether in England or in France, in Germany, Switzerland, or the United States, whilst parliamentary rule is seen to be everywhere falling to pieces, whilst its principles in themselves, and no longer merely their applications, are being criticized in every direction, how can intelligent men calling themselves revolutionary socialists seek to maintain a system already condemned to death? Representative government is a system which was elaborated by the middle class to make head against the royalty and, at the same time, to maintain and augment their domination of the workers. It is the characteristic form of middle class rule, but even its most ardent admirers have never seriously contended that a parliament or municipal body does actually represent a nation or a city. The more intelligent are aware that this is impossible. By upholding parliamentary rule, the middle class have been simply seeking to oppose a dam between themselves and royalty, or between themselves and the territorial aristocracy, without giving liberty to the people. It is, moreover, plain that as people become conscious of their interest, and as the variety of those interests increases, the system becomes unworkable. And this is why Democrats of all countries are seeking for different palliatives or correctives and cannot find them. They are trying the referendum and discovering that it is worthless. They prate of proportional representation, of the representation of minorities, and other parliamentary utopias. In a world, or in a word, they are striving to discover the undiscoverable. That is to say, a method of delegation which shall represent the myriad varied interests of the nation, but they are being forced to recognize that they are upon a false track, and confidence in government by delegation is passing away. It is only the social democrats and collectivists who are not losing this confidence, who are attempting to maintain so called national representation. And this is what we cannot understand. If our anarchist principles do not suit them, if they think them inapplicable, they ought, at least, as it seems to us, to try to discover what other system of organization could well correspond to a society without capitalists or landlords. But to take the middle class system, a system already in its decadence, a vicious system if ever there was one, and to proclaim this system, with a few innocent corrections, such as the imperative mandate or the referendum of the uselessness, of which has been demonstrated already, good for a society that has passed through the social revolution, is what seems to us absolutely incomprehensible, unless under the name of social revolution they understand something very different from revolution, some petty botching of existing middle class rule. The same with regard to the wage system. After having proclaimed the abolition of private property and the possession in common of instruments of production, how can they sanction the maintenance of the wage system under any form? And yet, this is what the collectivists are doing when they praise the efficiency of labor notes. That the English socialists of the early part of this century should invent labor notes is comprehensible. They were simply trying to reconcile capital and labor. They repudiated all idea of laying violent hands upon the property of the capitalist. They were so little of revolutionaries that they declared themselves ready to submit even to imperial rule, if that rule would favor their cooperative societies. They maintained They remained middle-class men at bottom, if charitable ones, and this is why Engels has said so in his preface to the Communist Manifesto of 1848. The socialists of that period were to be found among the middle class, while advancing workmen were communists. If later Proudhon took on the same idea, that again is easy to understand. What was he seeking in his mutualist system if not to render capital less offensive, despite the maintenance of private property, which he detested to the bottom of his heart, but which he believed necessary to guarantee the individual against the state? Further, if economists belonging more or less to the middle class also admit labor notes, it is not surprising, as it matters little to them whether the worker be paid in labor notes or in coin stamped with the effigy of king or republic. They want to save, in the upcoming overthrow, private property in inhabited houses, the soil, the mills, or to save, in the oncoming overthrow, private property in inhabited houses, the soil, the mills, or at least in inhabited houses, the necessary capital for the production of manufactures. And to maintain this property, labor notes will answer very well. If the labor note can be exchanged for jewels and carriages, the owner of house property will willingly accept it as rent, and as long as the inhabited house, the field, and the mill belong to individual owners, so long will it requisite to pay them in some way before they will allow you to work in their fields or their mills, or to lodge in their houses. And it will also be requisite to pay wages to the worker, either in gold or in paper money, or in labor notes, exchangeable for all sorts of commodities. But how can this new form of wages, the labor note, be sanctioned by those who admit that houses, fields, mills are no longer private property, that they belong to the commune or the nation? 2. The collectivist wage system. Let us examine more closely this system for the remuneration of labor as set forth by the English, French, German, and Italian collectivists. It comes very much to this. Everyone works, be in the fields, in factories, in schools, in hospitals, or whatnot. The working day is regulated by the state, to which belong the soil, factories, means, or whatnot. The working day is regulated by the state, which belonged to the soil, factories, means of communication, and all the rest. Each worker, having done a day's work, receives a labor note, stamped, let us say, with these words, 8 hours of labor. With this note, he can procure any sort of goods in the shops of the state or the various corporations. The note is divisible in such a way that 1 hour's worth of meat, 10 minutes' worth of matches, or half an hour's worth of tobacco can be purchased. Instead of saying 2 pennyworth soap, after the collectivist revolution, they will say 5 minutes' worth of soap. Most collectivists, faithful to the distinction established by the middle-class economists, and Marx also, between qualified, skilled, and simple, unskilled labor, tell us that qualified or professional toil should be paid a certain number of times more than simple toil. Thus, 1 hour of the doctor's work should be considered as equivalent to 2 or 3 hours of the work of the nurse, or 3 hours of that of the navvy. Professional or qualified labor will be multiple of simple labor, says the collectivist Grunlund, because this sort of labor demands a longer or shorter apprenticeship. Other collectivists, the French Marxists, for example, do not make this distinction. They proclaim equality of wages. The doctor, the schoolmaster, and the professor will be paid in labor notes at the same rate as the navvy. 8 hours spent working in the hospitals will be worth the same 8 hours spent in the navvy's work, or in the mine, or the factory. Some make further concession. They admit that disagreeable or unhealthy labor, such as that in the sewers, should be paid at a higher rate than work which is agreeable. 1 hour of service in the sewers may count, they say, for 2 hours of the labor of the professor. Let us add that and certain collectivists advocate the wholesale remuneration of trade societies. Thus, one society may say, here are 100 tons of steel. To produce them, 100 workers of our society have taken 10 days. As our day consisted of 8 hours, that make up 8,000 hours of labor for 100 tons of steel, rightly 80 hours a ton, upon which the state will pay them 8,000 labor notes for 1 hour each, and those 8,000 notes will be distributed amongst the fellow workers in the foundry as seems best to themselves. Or again, if 100 miners have spent 20 days in hoeing 8,000 tons of coal, the coal will be worth 2 hours a ton, and the 16,000 labor notes for 1 hour each received by the miners' union will be divided amongst them as they think fair. If there be disputes, if the miners protest and say that a ton of steel ought to cost 6 hours of labor instead of 8, or if the professor rate his day twice as high as the nurse, then the state must step in and regulate their differences. Such, in a few words, is the organization which the collectivists desire to see arising from the social revolution. As we have seen, their principles are collective property and the instruments of labor and remuneration of each worker according to the time spent in productive toil, taking into account the productiveness of his work. As for their political system, it would be parliamentary rule, ameliorated by the change of men in power and the imperative mandate, and the referendum, in essence, the general vote of yes or no upon questions submitted to the popular decision. Collectivists begin by proclaiming a revolutionary principle, the abolition of private property, and as soon as proclaimed, they deny it by maintaining organization of production and consumption springing from private property. They proclaim a revolutionary principle and ignore the consequences it must necessarily bring about. They forget that the very act of abolishing individual property in the instruments of production, land, factories, means of communication, capital, must cause society to set out in a new direction, that it must change production from top to bottom, change not only its methods but its ends, that all the everyday relations between individuals must be modified as soon as land, machinery, and the rest are considered as common possessions. They say no private property, and immediately they hasten to maintain private property in everyday forms. For productive purposes, you are a commune, they say, and the fields, the tools, the machinery, all that has been made up to this day, manufactures, railways, wharves, mines, all of you in common. Not the slightest distinction will be made discerning the share of each one in this collective property. Quote, but from tomorrow you are minutely to discuss the part that each one of you is to take in making the new machines, digging the new mines. From tomorrow you are to endeavor to weigh exactly the portion which will accrue to each one from the new produce. You are to count your minutes of work. You are to be on the watch, lest one moment of your neighbor's toil may purchase more than yours. You are to calculate your hours and your minutes of labor, and since the hour measures nothing, since in one factory a workman can watch 4 looms at once, whilst in another he only watches 2, you are to weigh the muscular force, the energy of brain, the energy of nerve expended. You are scrupulously to count up the years of apprenticeship, that you may value precisely the share of each one amongst you in the production of the future. And all this, after you have declared that you leave entirely out of your reckoning the share he has taken in the past. Well, It is evident to us that a society cannot organize itself upon two absolutely opposing principles, two principles which contradict one another at every step, and the nation or the commune which should give to itself such an organization would be forced to either return private property or to else transform it in itself in a communist society. 3. Unequal remuneration. We have said that most collectivist writers demand that in social society remuneration should be based upon a distinction between qualified or professional labor or simple labor. They assert that an hour of the engineer's, the architect's, or the doctor's work should be counted as 2 or 3 hours' work from the blacksmith, the mason, or the nurse. And the same distinction, say they, ought to be established between workers whose trades require a longer or shorter apprentice and those who are mere day laborers. Yes, but to establish this distinction is to maintain all the inequalities of our existing society. It is to trace out beforehand a demarcation between the worker and those who claim to rule him. It is still to divide society into two clearly defined classes, an aristocracy of knowledge above, a horny-handed democracy below, one class devoted to the service of the other, one class toiling with its hands to nourish and clothe the other, whilst other profits by its leisure to learn how to dominate those who toil for it. This is to take the distinctive features of middle-class society and sanction them by a social revolution. It is to erect into a principle an abuse which today is condemned in the society that is breaking up. We know very well what will be said in answer. We shall be told about scientific socialism. The middle-class economist, and Marx too, will be cited to prove that there is a good reason for the scale of wages and for the labor force of the engineer costs society more than the labor force of the navvy, and indeed have not the economists striven to prove that, if the engineer is paid 20 times more than the navvy, it is because the cost necessary to produce an engineer is more considerable than that necessary to produce a navvy? And has not Marx maintained that the like distinction between the various sorts of manual labor is of equal logical necessity? He could come to no other conclusion, since he took up Ricardo's theory of value and insisted that products exchange in proportion to the quantity of the work socially necessary to produce them. But we know also how much all of this to believe. We know that the engineer, the scientist, and the doctor are paid today 10 or 100 times more than the laborer, and the weaver earns 3 times as much as the toiler in the fields, and 10 times as much as a match girl. It is not because what they receive is in proportion to their various costs of production. Rather, it is in proportion to the extent of monopoly in education and industry. The engineer, the scientist, and the doctor simply draw their profits from their own sort of capital, their degree, their certificates, just as the manufacturer draws a profit from a mill, or as a nobleman used to do from birth and title. When employer pays the engineer 20 times more than the workman, he makes this very simple calculation. If an engineer can save him $4,000 a year in cost of production, he will pay him $800 a year to do it. And if he sees the foreman is a clever sweater, and could save him $400 in handicraft, he at once offers him $80 or $90 a year. He expends $100 where he counts upon gaining 1,000. That is the essence of the capitalist system, and the like holds good of the differences in various trades. Where then is the sense in talking of the cost of production of labor force, and saying that a student who passes a merry youth at the university has a right to 10 times higher wages than that of the son of a miner who has pined in a pit since he was 11, or that a weaver has a right to wages 3 or 4 times higher than those of an agricultural laborer. The expenditure needed to produce a weaver is not 4 times as great as the necessary cost of producing a field worker. The weaver simply benefits by the advantageous position in which industry enjoys in Europe as compared with other parts of the world, where at present there is no industrial development. No one has ever estimated the real cost of production of labor force, and if an idler costs society much more than an honest workman, it still remains to be known if, when all is told, infant mortality amongst the workers, the ravages of anemia, the premature deaths, a sturdy day laborer does not cost society more than an artisan. Are we to be told that, for example, the ones a day of the first a day of a London workwoman, and the 1 shilling a day of London workwoman, and the 3 drachma a day of the Avignon peasant who blinds herself over lace making represent the cost of production of these women? Are we perfectly aware that they often work for even less, but we know also that they do it entirely because, thanks to our splendid social organization, they would die of hunger without these ridiculous wages? The existing scale of wages seems to us a highly complex product of taxation, government interference, monopoly, and capitalist greed. In a word, of the state and the capitalist system. In our opinion, all theories made by economists about the scale of wages have been invented after the event to justify existing injustices. It is needless to regard them. We are, however, certain to be informed that the collectivist wage scale will, at all events, be an improvement. You must admit, we shall be told, that it will at least be better to have a class of workers paid at 2 or 3 times the ordinary rate than to have Rothschilds who put into their pockets in one day more than a workman can in a year. It will be a step towards equality. End quote. To us it seems to be a step away from it. To introduce into socialist society the distinction between ordinary and professional labor would be to sanction by revolution and erect into principle a brutal fact to which we merely submit today, considering it all the while unjust. And